Hey, welcome in. Get comfortable, let the day fade out, and we'll ease into a quiet story from medieval times. The story of King Arthur begins in uncertainty. It begins in post-Roman Britain, where Roman roads still crossed the land, but the empire behind them was gone. Villas decayed, walls cracked, Latin lingered in writing, Brittonic speech survived in the countryside. Christianity remained, but so did older habits of memory and storytelling. This is where Arthur first rises. Not yet the king of Camelot, not yet the husband of Guinevere or the center of the Round Table. At first, Arthur stands much farther back in the mist. That uncertainty gave the legend its power. Arthur stands at the point where history blurs into memory, memory into poetry, and poetry into myth. After Rome weakened in the early 5th century, Britain fragmented. Troops were withdrawn, central authority faltered, and local elites were forced to defend themselves. What followed was a harsher, more unstable world. That instability helped create heroic memory. When institutions fail, people remember the men who fought, held lines, and rallied others. In such a world, one warrior can grow larger than life very quickly. Post-Roman Britain was full of competing peoples and loyalties. Brittonic-speaking communities remained across much of the island. Anglo-Saxon settlement expanded in the east and south. Other regional powers mattered elsewhere. This was not a fairy tale kingdom waiting for a destined ruler. It was a fractured landscape. One of the earliest writers to describe this troubled Britain was Gildas, a 6th century cleric. He wrote of chaos, invasion, and a British victory at Bedtime. But he never named Arthur. That silence still shapes the debate. Some see it as a major problem for the idea of a historical Arthur. Others argue that silence proves little in a text focused more on moral warning than military detail. Either way, Arthur does not enter the record clearly. He arrives late. The first clearly datable text to mention Arthur by name is usually the Historia Brittonum, a Latin work linked to the 9th century. There, Arthur appears not as king, but as a dux bellorum, a leader of battles. The text gives him 12 victories, ending at Badon. That is already the language of legend. A warrior credited with 12 great battles is not being remembered in ordinary terms. Even so, the text remains crucial because it makes Arthur visible as a British war leader tied to resistance. The Annales Cambriae, the Welsh annals, helped fix 2 more moments in Arthurian memory, Badon and Camlann. One points to triumph, the other points to final ruin. So the shape of the legend appears early, victory followed by catastrophe. Arthur also lived in Welsh tradition, and there he often feels stranger and larger than a plausible commander. In early poetry and tale material, he appears as a heroic giant among men, a leader of remarkable companions, and a name used to measure all others. In Wygoduden, a warrior is praised, but he is said to be no Arthur. That passing line shows Arthur was already the standard of greatness. In Piagur and Colwich and Olwen, Arthur belongs to a world of named heroes, marvels, hunts, and impossible tasks. This is not yet the tragic king of later romance. It is an Arthur still close to oral tradition and an older heroic world. That is why Arthur's development was never simple. Different traditions gathered around his name. Some treated him as a war leader from the violent centuries after Rome. Others treated him as a mythic champion, moving through a world where battle and wonder belonged together. That mix made Arthur durable. He could belong to chroniclers because he seemed tied to Britain's survival. He could belong to storytellers because he was already larger than ordinary politics. Was there a real Arthur? No one can prove it. There is no universally accepted contemporary record that clearly identifies a historical King Arthur as later legend describes him. The earliest sources are silent, thin, or indirect. The sources that do name him come later, after memory had time to enlarge him. That has led to many theories. Arthur may have been a real war leader, whose deeds were magnified. He may have been a composite figure. Or he may have been, at root, a mythic and literary creation shaped by folklore, heroic memory, and political need. That political need mattered. In a fractured Britain, a heroic champion who resisted invaders was a powerful figure. Arthur could embody lost strength, endurance, and the belief that someone once stood firm when order collapsed. He also remained open to expansion. A battle leader could become a king could become the center of a heroic court, a dead ruler could become one who might return. The landscape absorbed him as well. Ruins, hills, stones, and strongholds became linked to Arthur's name. Tintagel is the clearest case. Archaeology shows it mattered in the early medieval period, though that does not prove Arthur was there. It does explain why later writers found it irresistible. That is how Arthur works. History gives a contour, landscape gives a stage, memory gives emotion, literature gives lasting form. By the time later medieval writers took hold of Arthur, they inherited a figure already tied to Badon, Camlann, Welsh heroic wonder, and Britain's survival in a rough age. That rough beginning matters. The Britain behind Arthur was a land of broken authority, shifting alliances, raids, and uncertainty. Communities needed stories that explained how they had endured and who had once stood for them. Arthur answered that need. Even if he was not one historical man, he became historically useful. He gave form to resistance and a face to courage. Then he kept growing. The warrior became wondrous. The name became royal. Soon he would gain Uther Pendragon, Merlin, prophecy, and the miracle of hidden kingship. But before any sword is drawn from stone, Arthur belongs here first, in the long echo of Rome's collapse, and in arguments that can never be fully settled. That is the true beginning of the legend. Not certainty, but accumulation. Not one clean historical life, but a deepening presence. Arthur endures because he is only partly visible. A fully documented man can be studied. A half-seen one can be followed forever. And so Arthur waits at the threshold of his own story, already alive as a name carried forward through ruin, and as the answer a fractured island gave itself when it wanted to believe that, once, someone had stood firm. From that belief, everything else would grow. If Arthur begins in uncertainty, he moves toward the center of the legend through secrecy. Before he becomes a king, he is a hidden child. Before the realm knows his name, he exists inside one of the oldest ideas in myth and monarchy alike, the rightful ruler who is present long before he is recognized. That part of the story begins with Uther Pendragon, Igraine, Merlin, and a kingdom still wounded by conflict. In later medieval tradition, Arthur is the son of Uther and Igraine. That familiar version comes mainly through Geoffrey of Monmouth and the writers who followed him, not from the earliest Arthurian traces. Geoffrey helped turn Arthur from a shadowy war leader into the heir of a royal line. Uther enters as a forceful ruler in an unstable Britain. Even his surname carries legend. A dragon-shaped sign appears in the sky, Merlin interprets it as a sign of kingship, and Uther becomes Pendragon. Politics is already being turned into symbol. Then Uther sees Igraine, the wife of Gorlois of Cornwall, and desire becomes disaster. Suspicion turns into war. Merlin offers Uther a way to reach her, using magic to disguise him as Gorlois so he can enter Tintagel. Arthur is conceived that night. Soon after, Gorlois is killed, and Uther marries Igraine. It is one of the darkest scenes in the legend, and it matters because Arthur's story does not begin in innocence. The kingdom that will later shine with chivalric ideals begins in secrecy, manipulation, and broken trust. It also makes Merlin more complicated than the softened wizard of later popular retellings. He is not merely wise. He is the architect of outcomes, willing to bend events toward what he believes must happen. Once Arthur is born, the child must be hidden. In later tradition, he is placed in the household of Sir Ector and raised without knowing his royal birth. There he grows up beside Kay, Ector's son, who becomes his foster brother. This hidden upbringing matters. The future king does not grow up on a throne, but in obscurity. Like many heroic childhoods, it protects him, delays recognition, and allows the rightful ruler to appear ordinary until the decisive moment. It also gives Arthur humility before glory. He is not introduced as an obvious prince, but as a boy in another man's house. Ector becomes crucial here. He is not Arthur's father by blood, but he helps shape the child who will become king. Rightful rule in the legend is inherited, but it must also be formed. Kay matters as well, because Arthur grows up in relation to someone else whose place seems secure until the truth is revealed. When Arthur's rank appears, it does not only raise him, it rearranges everyone around him. Then comes the miracle of recognition. This is where Arthurian tradition is often flattened, because the sword and the stone and Excalibur are not always the same thing. In the better-known later version, after Uther's death, Britain falls into confusion over succession. The realm needs a king, and Merlin establishes a sign, a sword fixed in stone, sometimes through an anvil, declaring that whoever draws it is the rightful ruler. Great men try and fail. Arthur succeeds almost by accident. In many retellings, he pulls the sword while trying to help Kay, who needs a weapon. Arthur finds the sword, draws it without understanding what it is, and brings it back as if he has only solved a simple problem. That detail is what gives the episode so much force. Arthur does not seize the sign of rule out of ambition. He lifts it in service. Only afterward does the realm grasp what has happened. When challenged, he repeats the feat. Ector understands the truth. Kay's expectations collapse. The hidden structure of the story becomes visible. This is one of the clearest moments of legitimacy in medieval legend. No argument can defeat the sign. The kingdom is shown who belongs at its center. Even then, acceptance is not always immediate. In several traditions, rival rulers resist Arthur's claim. Recognition by miracle does not erase politics. That tension gives his rise weight. The rightful king still has to survive the world he has been revealed to rule. The sword in the stone also carries a larger meaning. Medieval audiences cared deeply about rightful order, because broken succession and civil conflict were real fears. The idea that Providence might unmistakably reveal the true ruler had enormous appeal. It promised clarity when human judgment failed. Arthur is the child of secrecy, but he becomes king through revelation. He is conceived under disguise, hidden in youth, and recognized through a public sign. That pattern is the core of this stage of the legend. From Uther, he inherits royal blood and dynastic struggle. From Igraine, he inherits the human cost buried in the kingdom's foundation. From Merlin, he inherits destiny shaped by unsettling intelligence. From Ector and Kay, he inherits a childhood outside open power. From the sword and the stone, he inherits proof. Not modern proof, but narrative proof that the hidden boy is the rightful king. This stage of the story does not yet give us Camelot in full brightness, or the mature world of the Round Table, Lancelot, Guinevere's tragedy, the Grail, and the final war. What it gives is something more basic, the logic of Arthur himself. He is born from crisis. He is marked by secrecy. He is shaped away from the center. And when the moment comes, he is recognized because the world of the story briefly reveals its hidden design. That is why this part of the legend lasts. It answers an old longing, that in times of confusion, the true ruler may already be present, unnoticed, that greatness may live for years under ordinary appearances, and that when the kingdom reaches its breaking point, the right hand will close around the right sword. Arthur's story will grow much larger after this. He will fight, rule, gather knights, and inspire a kingdom whose glory will not last. But before any of that can happen, the legend must answer one question. Why Arthur? Its answer is simple. Because he was chosen before he was known. Because blood, prophecy, concealment, and miracle all converged on him. Because the kingdom could no longer recognize order on its own, and so order had to reveal itself. That is the work of this part of the story. The hidden child steps closer to the center. The secret begins to open. The boy in another man's house has touched the thing no one else could move. Soon the realm will begin to follow him. Once Arthur is recognized, the legend faces a new problem. Being named the rightful king is not the same thing as ruling. The sword in the stone proves who he is, but it does not give him a peaceful kingdom. Arthur has legitimacy, but not control. He has been chosen, but he still has to make that choice hold in a world full of older men, rival interests, wounded pride, and open force. That is why his accession is resisted. In later tradition, kings and nobles do not all accept him at once. A boy revealed by miracle is still a boy, and rival rulers are not eager to kneel before someone whose claim appears out of wonder rather than habit. Arthur must defend what the sign has revealed. He must turn revelation into obedience. Merlin remains essential here. He is still the mind behind Arthur's rise, but revelation alone is never enough. A kingdom has to be defended, organized, and persuaded into obedience. Merlin understands that kingship does not survive on symbolism alone. Even a chosen ruler must endure the ordinary pressures of power. So war enters almost immediately. Arthur's early reign is shaped by conflict with rulers unwilling to submit. These wars matter because they prove he is not only chosen but capable. Before Arthur became the polished king of romance, he was remembered as a leader of battles, and that older martial Arthur still lives inside the later legend. He fights not only to defend a crown, but to make the crown mean something. Without victory, recognition would remain a moment. With victory, it becomes a reign. That is what gives this stage of the story its force. Arthur does not simply inherit order, he creates it under pressure. His early kingship is not decorative. It is forged through resistance, and that allows the legend to keep one foot in the harsher world from which Arthur first emerged. This is also where Excalibur enters more clearly into the tradition. The sword in the stone usually proves kingship. Excalibur, by contrast, is the sword of established rule, often given by the Lady of the Lake. That difference matters. One sword reveals Arthur to the realm. The other arms him for kingship. With the Lady of the Lake, the story moves farther from bare succession and farther into a world where royal power is also enchanted. Excalibur becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a sign that Arthur's rule belongs partly to another order of reality. That otherworldly note changes the feeling of the legend. Arthur is no longer only the young man who survived a crisis of succession. He is becoming the king marked by wonder, the ruler whose authority seems to carry a sanction deeper than politics. The Lady of the Lake does not merely equip him, she helps elevate him. Even then, a kingdom is not made by magic alone. It also needs marriage, alliance, prestige, and visible order. That is where Guinevere enters with greater weight. Later legend remembers Guinevere for tragedy, but here she is queen before she is scandal. Her marriage to Arthur helps complete the image of kingship. A ruler with a queen, a household, and a court begins to look established. The kingdom gains not only a sovereign, but a royal center. That matters because rule must be seen as well as exercised. It is not enough for Arthur to win battles. He must also appear settled, elevated, and complete. Guinevere helps create that image. She belongs to the dignity of the reign even before later stories surround her with sorrow. So Arthur now has what he lacked before, the sign that named him, the victories that defended him, the sword that dignifies him, and the queen who helps make the kingdom look real. But Camelot is still becoming. The Round Table, one of the great symbols of Arthur's world, belongs more to later literary tradition than to the earliest layers of the legend. Wace is the first major writer to mention it clearly, and once he does, it becomes inseparable from Arthur. Its meaning is larger than furniture. A court is full of rivalry, and rank matters. The Round Table offers an ideal image of fellowship among great men who might otherwise be driven into constant comparison. It imagines strength without chaos and honor without humiliation. That is why the symbol endured. It suggests that Arthur's kingdom can do what real kingdoms rarely manage, gather proud and dangerous men into one fellowship without breaking either their greatness or the peace. This is one of the deepest longings inside the Arthurian world. A king should be strong, but not petty. His knights should be great, but not uncontrollable. Power should produce loyalty instead of envy. The Round Table gives visible form to that hope. Camelot grows around that ideal. Later tradition makes it the shining heart of Arthur's realm, the place where splendor and doom will one day meet. What matters here is that Arthur's kingship now has a center. A recognized ruler has become a visible court. A visible court has become an ideal. Arthur's world is no longer only about surviving violence or winning succession struggles. It begins to stand for something larger: just rule, fellowship, beauty, courage, and order, held together in one place. Camelot therefore matters not just as a setting, but as a promise. It is the promise that force can mature into justice, that rivalry can mature into fellowship, and that the shattered conditions from which Arthur rose can be transformed into something almost radiant. And because this is the Arthurian legend, that brightness is already fragile. Not betrayal yet, not collapse yet, but fragility, yes. The brighter Camelot becomes, the more painful its fall will be. The story needs this ascent. Arthur must feel worthy of admiration before tragedy enters. The kingdom must look almost like an answer to history's violence before it begins to break. That is why the early reign matters so much. It is the moment when Arthur stops being merely the hidden child recognized by miracle and becomes the king who can command belief. His authority now has several layers: bloodline, prophecy, public sign, martial success, enchanted confirmation through Excalibur, queenship, and courtly order. Together these create the Arthur who will dominate the rest of the legend. At this stage he is still central, still active, still close to the battle leader of older memory, but now elevated into a ruler who seems able to gather the realm into one shape. He is not yet overshadowed by the later brilliance of individual knights. The kingdom still draws its light most clearly from him. That is what makes this part of the story so satisfying. It offers an old longing that rightful leadership might do more than win. It might heal. Arthur's kingdom matters not only because it is strong, but because it appears to reconcile opposites that history rarely holds together for long. Force and justice, prestige and fellowship, royal authority and shared honor, the sword and the table. That combination is one reason Camelot glows so brightly. It is not just a court, it is a wish made visible. And Arthur is the man at its center. The hidden child has become the king who can hold a realm together. The claimant has become the ruler other men must reckon with. The youth revealed by miracle has survived the test of war. Soon the world around him will widen, more knights will gather. More stories will attach themselves to the court. Arthur's reign will become richer, grander, and more crowded with famous names. But this is the point where Arthur's world truly begins to shine. The crown is no longer only a claim. The kingdom is no longer only a battlefield. The sword is no longer only a sign. The court is no longer only a gathering of power. Together, they have become a vision. A realm that began in confusion has found its center. And Britain, in the logic of the legend, has entered the bright morning of Camelot. A kingdom does not become legendary through crowns and battles alone. It becomes legendary when the world around the throne begins to feel alive. By this stage of the Arthurian story, Arthur no longer stands alone as the hidden child revealed by miracle or the young king who survived resistance. He stands at the center of a court beginning to gather meaning around itself. Camelot starts to feel less like a political arrangement and more like a world. That is where the great court begins. Arthur is still the center, but he no longer carries the whole legend alone. The story's energy begins to flow through the figures around him. In this stage of the tradition, the king's greatness is measured not only by what he does, but by the kind of people his court attracts, the tensions it contains, and the atmosphere that gathers around it. At the heart of that court stands Guinevere. Later tradition remembers her for tragedy, but before she becomes a source of fracture, she is queen. She helps make Arthur's kingship visible in a way victory alone cannot. A kingdom with a queen begins to look complete. She gives shape to ceremony, dignity to the household, and grace to the court itself. That is why Guinevere matters so much in the brighter phase of the legend. She is not an ornament. She is part of Camelot's structure. Through her, the court becomes more than a military center. It becomes a place of hospitality, prestige, beauty, and social gravity. She helps turn rule into something people can feel as well as obey. That matters because kingship in medieval imagination is never only force. It is display, household order, ritual, and visible harmony. Guinevere helps create that harmony. Even before later romance surrounds her with sorrow, she is already essential to the court's radiance. If Guinevere gives Camelot visible grace, Merlin gives it depth and unease. By now, Merlin has already helped shape Arthur's life and rise. Yet he is never simply a counselor. He always stands slightly outside the order he helps create. He sees farther than others. He understands more than he explains. He is useful, but never fully comfortable. The medieval tradition makes him more unsettling than many softened modern retellings do. He guides, but he also manipulates. He helps create order, yet often through secrecy and ambiguity. Merlin reminds the legend that Camelot's bright surface was never the whole story. He also brings prophecy into the court. A king rules in the present, but a prophetic figure makes the present feel haunted by what is still coming. Merlin can help set destiny in motion. He cannot make human beings bear it well. That is part of what gives him such strange authority. He belongs to the kingdom, but never entirely to its ordinary rhythms. He is a builder of order who is never fully at rest inside order. His presence keeps reminding the legend that power always rests on forces it does not completely control. Then there is Morgan. Few Arthurian figures shift as much from text to text as Morgan Le Fay. She can appear as healer, enchantress, rival, enemy, or ambiguous guardian. Sometimes she feels tied to older magical traditions. Sometimes she appears as a more direct threat to the court. In every form, she carries instability. Morgan does not stand outside Arthur's world like a simple villain. She belongs to the same imaginative atmosphere. If Camelot represents order, she often represents the forces that order never fully masters: desire, resentment, enchantment, pride, and hidden knowledge. That is what makes her dangerous. She is not entirely alien to Camelot. She is close enough to reveal its weaknesses. In some traditions, that closeness feels familial. In others, it feels political or magical. In all of them, it makes her more interesting than a mere enemy at the gate. Morgan reminds the legend that what threatens a kingdom most deeply is often already within its circle. She represents the parts of Arthur's world that refuse to become orderly simply because the court wishes them to be. Her presence keeps alive the older and stranger energies that Camelot can never fully absorb. Arthur's court is also defined by the men around him. Even before Lancelot, Galahad, and the Grail tradition dominate the legend, Arthur's household already contains figures who matter greatly. Gawain is one of the most important. In earlier traditions, before Lancelot's later dominance, Gawain often stands near the front rank of Arthurian heroism. He gives prestige to the court and helps show that Camelot can generate greatness beyond the king himself. He is one of the clearest signs that Arthur's reign has produced not only order, but brilliance. Kay matters in a quieter way. As Arthur's foster brother, he preserves an older and rougher edge inside the court. In some texts, he is proud, sharp-tongued, or abrasive. That makes him useful. He reminds us that Arthur's world did not spring fully formed as a flawless pageant. It still contains household familiarity, irritation, and the uneven texture of real human bonds. Bedivere matters for a different reason. He often appears as the loyal companion, less dazzling than brighter figures, but deeply important to the emotional structure of the legend. Camelot needs not only great men, but faithful ones. It needs those whose worth is measured not only in splendor, but in constancy. Together, these figures give the court texture. A legendary kingdom cannot be made only of symbols, it must also feel inhabited. That is why feasts, oaths, welcomes, quarrels, and strange guests matter so much in Arthurian literature. They are not decorative details, they are how the court breathes. A feast is rarely just a meal. It is a place where rank, honor, tension, and marvel can all appear at once. Arthur's Hall becomes memorable because it is never still for long. Guests arrive with challenges. Unknown knights appear with demands. Vows are made in public. Reputation is tested in front of witnesses. The court is not only where power rests, it is where stories are constantly beginning. That is also why Camelot became so influential in later imagination. It feels like a center from which endless adventures can unfold. Knights leave it and return to it. Wonders arrive there before sending the court outward again. It is stable enough to anchor the legend, yet open enough to keep generating motion. Arthur's court also gathers several worlds that do not always sit easily together. It is Christian, but not stripped of older wonder. It is aristocratic, but haunted by folklore. It values order, yet keeps attracting marvels. It celebrates fellowship, yet lives under the threat of rivalry. That blend is one reason the Arthurian world endures. Camelot is never just one thing. It is a royal court, a household, a moral theater, and a borderland where the everyday and the enchanted keep meeting. That is why the people around Arthur matter so much. Guinevere gives the court grace and visible legitimacy. Merlin gives it foresight and unease. Morgan gives it mystery and internal threat. Gawain gives it knightly prestige. Kay gives it familiarity and edge. Bedivere gives it loyalty. Together they make Camelot feel less like an abstraction and more like a living center of human and legendary energy. That is essential because the story will ask us to mourn this world later. If Camelot is to break our hearts, it must first feel worth inhabiting. The court must feel warm enough, bright enough, and human enough for its later damage to matter. That is the deeper purpose of this stage of the legend. It does not exist merely to list characters around the throne. It exists to deepen the reality of Arthur's kingdom before the larger adventures and tragedies arrive. By now, Arthur is no longer only building a reign. He is presiding over a world. A queen brings ceremony to it. A prophet haunts it. An enchantress shadows it. Knights brighten it. Household loyalties steady it. Feasts, vows, and marvels keep it in motion. This is the court at the height of becoming. Not yet broken. Not yet exhausted by betrayal. Still gathering force. Still gathering the elements that will make its later fall feel like more than a political collapse. That is why the great court matters so much in the Arthurian story. It is the place where kingship becomes culture, where authority becomes atmosphere, where a realm becomes memorable not only because it is ruled, but because it is alive. Camelot has become more than a center of power. It has become a world people will not want to lose. By the time Arthur's court is fully alive, the legend begins to expand beyond Arthur himself. Arthur remains the king in the center, but as the tradition grows, especially through the French romances, more of its energy flows into the lives of individual knights. Camelot becomes rich enough to produce heroes who seem capable of carrying legends of their own. That widening is one of the great strengths of the Arthurian world. Instead of staying fixed on its king alone, the legend grows by letting the court generate new centers of gravity. Among the earliest of those stands Gawain. Before Lancelot came to dominate later romance, Gawain held a major place in Arthurian tradition. In many earlier texts, he is brave, noble, formidable, and closely tied to Arthur's household. He shows that Camelot has become a court capable of producing greatness beyond the king himself. That matters because Arthurian legend was never fixed in one final arrangement. different writers favored different heroes. Gawain belongs to an older balance of the legend, one in which the king's nearest kin and companions carry much of the court's weight. He also reveals a tension inside chivalry. Gawain can appear courtly and fierce, admirable and flawed. In some traditions, he comes close to the ideal knight. In others, he is marked by pride or anger. That range shows that Camelot's greatness was never simple purity. Arthur's court is now more than a place where order rests. It becomes a place from which questing identity can emerge. Knights leave the court, enter strange landscapes, undergo trials, and return changed, praised, or humbled. The legend is no longer only about kingship. It is about what kingship makes possible. That development owes much to Chrétien de Troyes. In the 12th century, he helped reshape the Arthurian world into something more inward and more interested in individual testing than earlier battle-centered tradition had been. Under his influence, Arthur's court becomes the center from which stories of wandering knights, moral challenge, love, reputation, and self-discovery unfold. Yvain shows that change clearly. In Yvain, or The Knight of the Lion, the knight's story becomes not just a matter of feats, but of inner failure, recovery, and renewed worth. The knight is no longer memorable only because he wins. He is memorable because outward adventure reflects inward difficulty. Adventure is no longer just action. It becomes revelation. Forests, castles, bridges, and strange tests become ways of discovering what a knight truly is. Arthur's court supplies the prestige. The wider world supplies the trial. Then comes Lancelot. If Gawain is one of the early stars of Arthurian heroism, Lancelot becomes the knight who transforms the emotional structure of the legend. With Lancelot, the tradition becomes more psychologically charged and more deeply entangled with the idea that the greatest worldly excellence may be inseparable from private contradiction. In many versions, Lancelot is the greatest knight in the world. He stands at the highest peak of worldly chivalry, and that brilliance is tied to his problem. Lancelot's greatness is bound to love. Not safe love, but the courtly and destructive love that binds him to Guinevere. This is one of the decisive changes romance brings into the legend. In an older heroic world, strength and loyalty were tested mainly in battle. In the later Arthurian world, they are also tested in desire. A knight may be unmatched with a sword, and yet endangered by the hidden structure of his own heart. Lancelot is the clearest example. He is magnificent, yet the devotion that makes him extraordinary also places him on a path that will eventually wound the kingdom he serves. That contradiction gives Arthurian legend much of its power. The greatest knight is not simply the kingdom's savior. He is also part of its future fracture. At this stage, though, the emphasis is still on expansion rather than collapse. Lancelot enters the court as a new summit of knightly possibility. He makes Camelot feel even more dazzling because he seems to embody everything the ideal knight should be. Yet courtly love complicates that ideal. It turns desire into discipline, longing into service, and emotional conflict into a test of honor, secrecy, and suffering. That made it perfect for the Arthurian world. Camelot is a place of high ideals and dangerous proximity. Reputation matters intensely, so do loyalty and restraint. The more refined the court becomes, the more charged its emotional atmosphere becomes as well. Lancelot and Guinevere give the court a new emotional center, one more intimate and more perilous than anything found in the earlier battle tradition. That is one reason Arthurian romance can feel strikingly modern. It understands that human beings can be most impressive where they are also most divided. Lancelot is not diminished by that contradiction. He is intensified by it. He turns Camelot from a merely splendid kingdom into a more emotionally volatile one. He also reveals a larger truth about the Arthurian world. Chivalry is an ideal, but it is also a pressure, and often an impossible standard. That is why its most compelling knights are not those who glide through perfection, but those who reveal what the strain costs. Gawain reveals it in one way, Yvain in another, Lancelot above all. Each of them helps the legend move beyond simple heroics into something richer. At the same time, Arthur's role subtly changes. The king remains the head of the court, but more of the emotional action unfolds in the lives of the knights. Arthur becomes the luminous center around which others move. That is the paradox of Arthur's expanding world. The more the legend broadens into other lives, the more impressive Arthur's achievement seems. Only a truly legendary court could produce Gawain, Yvain, Lancelot, and the rest. The world beyond Camelot also widens in the romances. It stretches across forests, foreign courts, hidden chapels, strange castles, and symbolic landscapes where inner and outer trial merge. And yet the center still holds, at least for now. Arthur's court remains the place that gives all this wandering glory its meaning. Without Camelot, the adventures would become disconnected episodes. With Camelot, they become facets of a single world. That is what this stage of the legend accomplishes. It shows that Arthur's kingdom has become abundant enough to overflow the life of Arthur alone. The king's greatness is no longer proven only by his own actions. It is proven by the greatness of those who gather around him. Gawain gives the court heroic prestige. Yvain gives it inward complexity. Lancelot gives it dazzling brilliance and dangerous emotional depth. Together they show what Camelot can generate at its height. Arthur's world is no longer merely rising. It is flowering. It becomes a kingdom of stories, a radiant center from which greatness keeps emerging. That radiance will not last forever. The very richness that makes Camelot so compelling will eventually help expose its fragility. But for now, the court is still in bloom. Its knights are riding outward. Its ideals are still bright enough to be believed. And Arthur remains the king whose world has become large enough to hold them all. After the flowering of Arthur's court comes a different kind of test. Not lineage, not military power, not even courtly reputation alone. The legend now turns toward holiness, purity, and the longing for a perfection that earthly greatness cannot quite reach. This is where the Holy Grail enters with full force. And once it does, Camelot changes. Until this point, Arthur's world has expanded through kingship, fellowship, adventure, and the brilliance of individual knights. The Grail asks a question all that splendor cannot easily answer. What if even the greatest court in the world is not enough? What if courage, fame, courtesy, strength, and love are still lesser things besides spiritual worth? That question gives the Grail tradition its power. It does not merely add another treasure to the Arthurian world. It changes the scale by which everything is measured. The earliest form of the Grail appears in Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval, where it enters the legend as something mysterious and not yet fully fixed in meaning. It begins as wonder before it becomes doctrine. That matters. The Grail does not begin as a simple object with one stable explanation. It begins as mystery, and that mystery is first felt through Perceval. Perceval is not a polished knight. He begins in innocence, awkwardness, and partial knowledge. In the Grail Castle, he sees marvels he does not understand, and fails to ask the question he should have asked. That failure becomes one of the founding moments of the Grail tradition. It suggests that purity is not the same as readiness, and that wonder without understanding is not enough. That is a major shift in the Arthurian legend. In earlier adventures, a knight might win by strength or endurance. In the Grail world, those qualities become secondary. The deeper test is whether a man can see truly, ask rightly, and become inwardly worthy of what stands before him. As the Grail tradition develops in later texts, especially in the prose cycles, it becomes more clearly Christian in meaning. It is tied to sacred history, divine grace, and the highest mysteries of the faith. Once that happens, the Arthurian world grows more solemn. Camelot had seemed like the highest form of earthly order, the best king, the finest knights, the most radiant court. But the Grail reveals that earthly magnificence is not the same as holiness. That is why the Grail quest is so unsettling. It does not simply send knights outward in search of glory. It exposes them. The quest reveals what each knight can carry and what each knight cannot bear. It is less an expedition than a judgment moving through the court. And nowhere is that clearer than in Lancelot. By worldly standards, Lancelot is the greatest knight alive. If Camelot were judged only by chivalric excellence, he would seem almost unbeatable. But the Grail does not judge by those standards alone. That is why Lancelot's place in the Grail tradition is so powerful. He can come close, he can glimpse, he can feel the nearness of what he cannot fully attain. Yet he cannot complete the quest. The reason is not weakness in combat, it is the divided state of his soul. His love for Guinevere, which made him one of the most compelling figures in the courtly world, becomes in the Grail world a barrier. The contradiction that gave him greatness now limits him. This is one of the most painful truths in the legend. The greatest worldly knight fails at the highest spiritual test. That failure does not make him contemptible, it makes him tragic in a deeper way. He is not exposed as false, he is exposed as incomplete. If Lancelot embodies magnificent insufficiency, Galahad embodies the opposite. In later Grail tradition, especially in the prose cycles and Mallory, Galahad appears as the perfect knight. Often presented as Lancelot's son, he succeeds where the father cannot. The knight greatest in earthly terms gives way to one whose greatness is spiritual as well as martial. Galahad matters because he represents the answer to the Grail's demand. He is chaste, spiritually clear, and capable of bringing the quest to completion. Where other knights strain, Galahad moves with almost otherworldly certainty. That is part of the point. Galahad does not confirm the ordinary greatness of Camelot. He surpasses it. He shows that the court's ideals, however noble, were never the highest possible ideals. Bors matters for a related reason. He is neither the dazzling center that Lancelot is, nor the near untouchable ideal that Galahad is. He is steadier and more accessible. In many versions, Bors proves worthy enough to continue in the Grail quest. He is not perfect, but he is faithful and disciplined enough to endure. That makes him important. He suggests that the Grail world is not divided only between perfection and failure. There is also steadfast worthiness. Then there is the effect of the quest on the court itself. This may be the most important part. The Grail quest weakens Camelot. Not because it is evil, not because the search is a mistake, but because the best knights leave, and because some of them do not return the same. A kingdom built on fellowship cannot lose so much of its fellowship without damage. The quest does not destroy Camelot by violence. It hollows Camelot by transcendence. Its finest men are drawn toward a reality greater than the kingdom, and the kingdom suffers for it. That is one of the most haunting patterns in the legend. Camelot is not first broken by invading armies or even by open treason. It is weakened by the fact that its highest aspirations point beyond itself. So the Grail quest creates an atmosphere unlike anything that came before it. Earlier adventures were often bright with danger and prestige. The Grail stories are more solemn, more still, and more sorrowful. They carry the sense that Arthur's kingdom has already passed its height, even before the final collapse arrives. The court can still glitter, but some of its innocence is gone. Its limits have been exposed. Arthur himself is changed by that knowledge. He remains the king, but the Grail reveals that even the greatest king cannot command holiness the way he commands allegiance. Spiritual fulfillment cannot be organized like a court. That humility is part of why this section matters so much. It lifts the story above worldly triumph without mocking worldly greatness. Camelot was real in its own terms, but the Grail insists that there is still more. And that more cannot be owned. It can only be approached, sometimes glimpsed, and only rarely received. That is why the Grail stories feel so charged with longing. They are about distance, between the ideal knight and the holy knight, between earthly glory and spiritual perfection, between what Camelot can become and what it can never wholly be. Percival feels that distance in innocence. Lancelot feels it in failure. Bors feels it in endurance. Galahad crosses it. And once he does, the court can never quite return to what it was before. That is the deepest effect of the Grail on the Arthurian legend. It does not merely enrich the world, it reveals the world's insufficiency. Camelot was the highest earthly kingdom its storytellers could imagine. But even Camelot was not heaven. That realization leaves the court more solemn, more divided, and more vulnerable than it had been before. Its greatness remains, but now it stands in the shadow of something greater. And that shadow is beautiful. It is also the beginning of the end. After the Grail, the Arthurian legend no longer moves with the same innocence. Camelot still stands, but something essential has changed. The Grail had already exposed limits inside the court, and drawn some of its finest strength away from the fellowship that once made the kingdom seem almost inexhaustible. What follows now is not a sudden fall from perfection, it is the widening of cracks that were already there. And at the center of those cracks stands love. Not love as comfort, but love as divided loyalty, hidden wound, and public danger. This is where the bond between Lancelot and Guinevere moves fully into the foreground. By now that bond has become inseparable from the emotional life of the legend. Camelot is no longer only the kingdom of Arthur. It is also the kingdom haunted by what its greatest knight and its queen feel for one another. Their love gives the story much of its intensity because it is not easy to dismiss. It grows within a world built on honor, restraint, loyalty, and visible order. That is why the affair matters so much. If the relationship were merely selfish, the legend would lose much of its force. What makes it tragic is that Lancelot and Guinevere are not simply shallow betrayers. Their bond is often written with seriousness, depth, and emotional conviction. It can feel nearly inseparable from the very courtly ideals Camelot claims to honor. And that is the problem. The court that refined love into devotion also created conditions in which love could become destructive. Camelot is a place of dangerous nearness. The queen is not distant from the court's finest men. The greatest knight is not sealed against desire. The very beauty of the court increases the risk within it. That is one reason the Lancelot and Guinevere story became so enduring. It is not merely scandal inside a royal household. It is a contradiction lodged inside the ideal itself. The greatest knight, whose duty should bind him to the king above all, is drawn toward the queen. The queen, who helps give the kingdom its visible legitimacy, becomes the center of hidden disorder. Arthur's position is part of what gives the legend its dignity. He is not just the husband Guinevere should not betray. He is the king whose household is bound to the kingdom's order. What wounds him does not remain private. It spreads outward into the political and moral structure of the realm. That is why the affair cannot stay an affair. In an ordinary household, adultery is a personal catastrophe. In Camelot, it becomes constitutional. The king's marriage belongs to the kingdom's visible order. The queen is part of public meaning. The greatest knight is part of public strength. Once those two are bound together in secrecy, the court begins to divide internally, even before the secret is fully exposed. That division matters because Arthurian tragedy is rarely caused by one villain alone. The fall of Camelot does not come simply from an enemy storming the gates. It comes from loyalties that cannot all remain true at once. Lancelot owes Arthur service. Guinevere owes Arthur fidelity. Arthur owes justice to the realm. The Round Table owes itself fellowship. But once love and kingship come into conflict, those obligations no longer align. Someone must break faith somewhere. That is what gives this part of the legend such weight. The disaster is not imposed from outside. It grows from the inability of human beings to satisfy every claim made upon them at once. Eventually, the hidden structure breaks open. In later tradition, especially in Malory, figures such as Agravain and Mordred help expose the relationship. The revelation does not come in a vacuum. It comes through a court already charged with rivalry, resentment, and competing loyalties. Once scandal enters, those older tensions become explosive. What follows is one of the most painful turns in the whole legend. Fellowship becomes faction. The court that once gathered knights into shared honor begins to separate them into opposing obligations. Some stand by the king's justice. Some are drawn by loyalty toward Lancelot. Some are driven by moral outrage, personal grievance, or old resentment. That is why the affair destroys more than trust. It destroys simplicity. No one can remain only one thing anymore. A knight is no longer only brave or famous. He must decide where he stands. A king is no longer only the source of order. He becomes a husband forced to act in public under humiliation and law. A queen is no longer only the center of grace. She becomes the center of judgment. Lancelot's role here is especially tragic because his greatness is real. He is not a weak man, stumbling into ruin through trivial appetite. He is one of the noblest and most formidable figures in the tradition. That is why his failure matters so much. If an ordinary knight had sinned, the court might have punished him and remained intact. But Lancelot is too central to be cut away without damage. So when crisis comes, everything tears. Love does not cancel admiration. Even at the point of fracture, many versions preserve the sense that Lancelot remains magnificent. That makes the tragedy sharper. The kingdom is not brought down by mediocrity. It is wounded by greatness divided against itself. Guinevere, too, remains more than a symbol of failure. She can appear loving, dignified, guilty, fearful, loyal in one direction, and destructive in another. That complexity is essential. She remains tragically human inside a court that asked human beings to live by nearly impossible standards. Arthur's response is shaped by that same pressure. He cannot simply ignore what has happened. A king who lets such a breach pass unanswered would compromise his own authority and the meaning of justice in the realm. Yet to act is also to break the fellowship that gave his kingdom its strength. That is the trap. Arthur is not free. Neither are Lancelot and Guinevere. Each is bound by claims that now collide. Once the affair is exposed, the legend moves toward rescue, pursuit, civil conflict, and death. In many tellings, Guinevere is condemned, and Lancelot's effort to save her becomes the spark that transforms hidden disorder into open violence. What was once secret and intimate becomes armed and public. And once swords are drawn between those who once sat at the same table, Camelot is never the same again. The rescue of Guinevere is the moment private love openly breaks public order. It declares that the greatest knight in the world will stand against the king's justice for the sake of the queen. No court built on fellowship can absorb that without splitting. The consequences unfold through grief as much as through action. Knights die, old loyalties harden. The lines between justice, vengeance, love, and honor become harder to hold apart. This is especially true in the conflict involving Gawain and his kin. When blood is spilled in the unraveling of the court, the matter no longer belongs only to Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere. It widens into family loyalty, mourning, and the demand for retribution. Gawain, who once embodied the prestige of Arthur's court, becomes part of its deepening fracture. That is why the fall feels earned. The kingdom is not shattered by random misfortune alone. It is shattered because its highest ideals were always in tension. Chivalry demanded loyalty, but also personal honor. Courtly love elevated devotion, but not always lawful devotion. Kingship demanded justice, but justice in such a world could tear through affection and gratitude. The Round Table promised fellowship, but fellowship could not survive every competing claim. The story does not say these ideals were false. It says they could not remain perfectly aligned in human hands. That is the harder truth. Camelot fails not because it never meant anything. Camelot fails because it meant too much. It tried to hold together love, justice, loyalty, beauty, excellence, order, and freedom of spirit all at once. For a while, it almost seemed to succeed. That is why its collapse is so painful. By this point, that loss is no longer theoretical. The court that once welcomed marvels now sends out armed men against itself. The fellowship that once created greatness now feeds division. The love that once intensified the legend now helps unravel it. This is the emotional heart of Arthurian tragedy. Not merely that Camelot falls, but that Camelot falls from within. No invading army could wound it as deeply as the divided hearts of its own greatest figures. Arthur still reigns. Lancelot still shines. Guinevere still matters. The court still exists. But all of them now stand under a different light. The brightness has become painful. The ideals have become burdens. And the kingdom, though not yet at its final battlefield, is already entering the long catastrophe from which it will not recover. Love has done what armies could not. It has made the Round Table choose against itself. And once that choice is forced, the road to the end lies open. After love divides the court, the legend moves toward its most irreversible ruin. Camelot has not yet vanished, but by this point, its destruction is no longer distant. The fellowship is fractured. The king's justice is tangled with grief. Great knights have already been lost to spiritual distance, political conflict, or divided loyalty. The order that once seemed almost impossible to break has learned how easily it can be turned against itself. Now the last betrayal enters, and with it comes Mordred. Mordred shifts across the tradition, but in later medieval legend he hardens into the final internal betrayer, the usurper who rises when Arthur's kingdom is too wounded to defend itself. That matters because Mordred is not merely another enemy. Arthur has fought enemies before. Mordred is more devastating because he belongs to the story's inner corruption. He is not the blow from outside. He is what happens when a kingdom's own bonds have weakened beyond repair. By the time Mordred moves decisively, Arthur's attention is already drawn elsewhere, often toward the aftermath of the conflict with Lancelot. That absence is crucial. The king is no longer fixed at the center of a united court. He is pulled outward by the damage already done. That is when the opening appears. Mordred takes advantage of the divided realm. In some traditions he seizes the crown, in others he also seeks Guinevere. However, the details vary, the pattern is the same. Arthur's absence gives treachery room to declare itself openly. This is not just a military crisis. It is a symbolic one. A kingdom that once represented the highest visible order now finds its center occupied by false rule. What Arthur built through revelation, battle, marriage, fellowship, and sacrifice is now claimed through betrayal. That is why Mordred's rise feels so chilling. He is not stronger than Arthur. He succeeds because Arthur's world has already been weakened by its own failures. Guinevere's place in this crisis changes across traditions, but the emotional truth remains the same. She stands at the edge of the kingdom's final unmaking. The queen who once gave Camelot visible grace now belongs to the broken world left behind when grace fails to hold. Arthur returns toward a kingdom no longer fully his. That return carries some of the deepest sorrow in the legend. He is not riding home to restore a troubled court. He is riding into the wreckage of what once gave his kingship meaning. The Round Table is no longer whole. His fellowship has been divided by love, blood, and vengeance. His trust has already been broken at the center. Now the realm itself stands under a rival claim. At this point, the story gathers a feeling it has long been moving toward. Doom. Not ordinary fear, but doom in the older sense, foreknown, solemn, and difficult to escape even when clearly seen. That matters because the final battle is not written as one more war. It is the war in which everything converges. Earlier battles made Arthur's kingship real. This one reveals how little remains to save. Many versions thicken the air before Camlann with omens and warnings. But by now prophecy has lost any power to rescue. The tragedy of late Camelot is not that no one sees danger, it is that danger has advanced beyond the point where seeing is enough. That gives the last movement of the legend its peculiar sadness. The kingdom is not blind. It is exhausted. Too much has already happened. Too many loyalties have already been broken. Even wisdom now arrives too late. Gawain's death deepens that sorrow further. Once one of the brightest figures of Arthur's court, he becomes one of the signs that the old Camelot is truly passing away. The end of Arthur's reign is never only about Arthur. It is about the loss of a whole world. Then comes Camlann. For all the richness of the tradition around it, the essential meaning of the battle is brutally simple. Arthur and Mordred meet. The kingdom destroys itself to eliminate its betrayer. Victory and ruin become the same event. That fusion gives Camlann its force. This is not the triumphant battle of a young king proving himself. Camlann is the place where the legend stops pretending Camelot can be restored to what it was. Arthur can still defeat Mordred, but he cannot save the world that victory was meant to protect. That is the tragic center of the battle. The king succeeds and fails in the same motion. He strikes down the usurper. He loses the kingdom. Mordred's death confirms that betrayal cannot inherit the story. But Arthur's wound matters even more, because it shows that rightful kingship itself has become mortal. After that stroke, the legend begins to empty. The noise of battle gives way to aftermath. The king is wounded. The kingdom is broken. The fellowship is largely gone. What remains now is not rule, but farewell. This is where Bedivere becomes essential. He is not the brightest knight in the tradition, but at the very end he becomes indispensable because he remains. In the last hours of a kingdom, faithfulness outlives splendor. Arthur commands Bedivere to take Excalibur and return it to the water. That moment is one of the most perfect gestures in the legend. The sword that once confirmed Arthur's extraordinary kingship cannot simply remain in the world. It must be relinquished. Bedivere hesitates. Excalibur is too beautiful and too charged with memory to surrender easily. But Arthur knows better. The sword does not belong to Bedivere, or even finally to the broken kingdom. It belongs to the Order of Wonder from which it came. When Bedivere obeys and casts Excalibur into the water, the hand that rises to receive it is one of the most unforgettable images in medieval legend. The world of marvel takes back what the world of men can no longer keep. That return of the sword feels like more than the end of a battle. It feels like the withdrawal of an age. Then comes the final departure. Arthur does not simply die in the ordinary way of kings. He is borne away toward Avalon, the island that hovers at the edge of the legend, as a place of healing, mystery, and otherworldly continuation. Different traditions handle this differently, but the effect is consistent. Arthur does not vanish into simple closure. He passes beyond ordinary reach. That matters because the legend refuses to end with mere extinction. The king is mortally wounded. The kingdom is lost. The fellowship is broken. And yet Arthur is not reduced to a corpse and a completed past. Instead, he is carried into uncertainty once more, as he first emerged from uncertainty long ago. That is one of the deepest beauties of the whole legend. Arthur begins as a figure only partly visible, standing between history and memory. He ends in the same condition. He leaves the world, but not in such a way that the world can be sure it has fully lost him. That is why Avalon matters so much. A dead king can be mourned. A king carried into mystery can be awaited. Arthur has become the kind of figure people do not easily surrender. Too much meaning has gathered around him for the legend to let him end, like any other ruler. That does not remove the tragedy. It deepens it. Arthur goes to Avalon not at the height of triumph, but after everything that made Camelot radiant has been torn apart. His passing is not escape from sorrow. It is sorrow lifted into myth. This section, then, is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of final convergence. Love has already divided the court. The Grail has already shown the court's insufficiency. Mordred has already exploited the kingdom's weakness. Now Camlann gathers all those failures and resolves them in one last field of blood. The usurper is destroyed. The king is destroyed. The kingdom is destroyed. And yet the legend still refuses complete annihilation. Excalibur returns to the lake. Arthur passes to Avalon. The world loses Camelot, but not entirely the hope attached to Arthur's name. That is why the ending feels both terrible and strangely exalted. It is a catastrophe, but it is also a transformation. The king who once seemed to promise perfect earthly order becomes, in his departure, something more elusive and more enduring than order alone. He becomes memory shaped into expectation. He becomes loss that refuses to become emptiness. Even the greatest kingdom can die. But not every king, once imagined deeply enough, is allowed to disappear. After Camlann, the Arthurian legend does something unusual. It refuses to end cleanly. A lesser story might have closed on the battlefield. The king is wounded. The traitor is dead. The kingdom is broken. The sword is returned. The old order falls, and history moves on. But Arthur's legend does not accept that kind of finality. Instead, after the ruin of Camelot, it lingers. It looks out across the water and carries the king beyond ordinary reach. In doing so, it transforms defeat into something stranger and more enduring than victory alone. This is where Avalon matters most. Avalon had already stood at the edge of the legend as a place of mystery, healing, and otherworldly possibility. After Camlann, it becomes more than a distant island. It becomes the space into which Arthur passes when the world can no longer hold him in ordinary form. Arthur is not merely buried. He is borne away. That difference has shaped the power of the story for centuries. A buried king belongs to the past. A king taken to Avalon belongs partly to the future. That is why the passage to Avalon is so important. It changes the meaning of Arthur's defeat. Camlann still destroys the kingdom. The tragedy remains real. But Arthur is not left behind as only one more fallen ruler among many. He passes into uncertainty, and uncertainty is where Arthur has always been strongest. That gives the legend a kind of symmetry. Arthur first emerged from a world where history, memory, and myth could not be cleanly separated. He now returns to that same borderland. He leaves the visible world, but not in a way that lets the world say with full confidence that it has lost him forever. That is why Avalon matters emotionally. It gives grief somewhere to go besides the grave. It gives loss a horizon. It makes mourning inseparable from waiting. Morgan matters here as well. Throughout the legend, Morgan Le Fay shifts between forms: healer, enchantress, rival, danger, ambiguous force at the edge of Camelot's order. But in the tradition surrounding Arthur's departure, she is often tied to Avalon and to the king's passage beyond the human court. That restores some of her older ambiguity. She is not only a destabilizing presence, she is also part of the otherworldly frame that receives Arthur at the end. This gives Morgan a peculiar dignity. She belongs to the magical world Camelot never fully mastered. Yet at the very end, that same world becomes the place where Arthur goes for healing or concealment. The court could not save itself. The political realm could not hold together. The fellowship failed. But the island beyond ordinary reach still remains. That does not turn Avalon into a cheerful refuge. Arthur goes there wounded. He goes there after catastrophe. He goes there because the kingdom has already proved unable to remain what it was. Yet the fact that he goes there at all matters enormously. The legend refuses to say that the king simply died and was finished. This refusal is one of the deepest keys to Arthur's endurance. People can admire a dead king. They can mourn a dead king. But a king who may return belongs to imagination in a different way. That is how Arthur becomes the once and future king. Even if the exact phrasing is later, the deeper pattern is older. Arthur is the ruler who is not entirely gone, the king whose loss is never experienced as full extinction, the figure who remains available to hope. He is not only memory, he is potential. That distinction matters. A merely historical ruler can inspire nostalgia. A hidden ruler can inspire expectation. Once Camelot falls, the story could have become only a warning about human failure. Instead, it says that the ideal kingdom may die, but the king attached to that ideal may remain unfinished. That unfinished quality gave Arthur unusual power in later centuries. A people imagining decline could turn toward him. A people imagining restoration could turn toward him. Arthur's return did not have to be proven. It only had to remain imaginable. That is enough for myth. Even the question of Arthur's grave reflects that tension. If Arthur is really gone, where is he? If he is buried, can the world point to the place? And if it can, does the story lose something? These are not small matters. Legends often gather around graves because graves promise closure. But in Arthur's case, closure is precisely what the tradition resists. That is why later claims to Arthur's remains, especially at Glastonbury, carry such strange energy. A discovered grave offers proof and authority, but it also threatens to flatten the mystery that made Arthur last. That tension is revealing. The historical instinct wants a body. The legendary instinct wants an absence. Arthur survives because the second instinct keeps winning. The legend is strongest when the king remains just out of reach, not so distant that he becomes meaningless and not so present that he becomes ordinary. That is why the passage to Avalon feels less like an ending than a withdrawal. Arthur leaves the world, but the world remains oriented toward him. The broken kingdom behind him is real, but the possibility attached to his name outlives the kingdom. That difference is everything. It turns defeat into legend. It turns sorrow into expectation. It turns the fallen king into the absent center of an unfinished story. That unfinished quality helps explain why Arthur never stays confined to one century or one text. So long as the story leaves room for return, it leaves room for reuse. Each age can imagine that the king sleeps, heals, or waits somewhere beyond the visible horizon. That idea belongs to the larger pattern of the hidden king who will return when most needed. But Arthur gives the pattern unusual depth, because he is attached not only to power, but to a lost ideal of justice, fellowship, beauty, and order. People do not wait for Arthur merely because he was strong. They wait for what his kingdom seemed to promise. That is why Avalon and the return motif cannot be reduced to fantasy decoration. They answer the unbearable fact that Camelot failed. If the kingdom was once radiant enough to feel almost like history healed, then its destruction cannot simply be left as a closed wound. The legend needs a way to keep faith with what was lost. Arthur's unfinished departure becomes that way. He is gone, yet not entirely surrendered. Absent, yet not emptied of force. Wounded, yet not wholly extinguished. This also changes how we look back at the whole story. Once Arthur is imagined as a king who may return, the rise of Camelot takes on a different color. It is no longer only the history of a kingdom that shone and fell. It becomes the memory of a possibility suspended rather than abolished. That is one reason Arthur feels so difficult to replace. Many heroic rulers in legend can be admired, but once they die, the emotional work is done. Arthur's legend refuses that completion. His departure leaves the story open in a way that keeps drawing people back. And there is another reason that refusal of closure matters. It gives dignity to loss without pretending loss did not happen. Camelot is not restored in this section. The dead do not rise, the fellowship does not reform. Nothing erases the catastrophe of Camlann. Instead, the legend does something harder. It lets the catastrophe stand, while also insisting that catastrophe is not the last thing worth saying. Arthur passes beyond it. Not beyond sorrow, but beyond final reduction. He is not allowed to become only the king who failed. He becomes the king whose failure could not contain him. That is why this section matters so much. It is the place where the Arthurian legend decides what kind of loss it wants to be. It could have chosen pure tragedy. It could have chosen simple memorial. Instead, it chooses haunted endurance. Avalon makes that endurance imaginable. Morgan helps hold its threshold. The dream of return gives it emotional force. And the absence of final proof keeps it alive. Arthur's story ends politically at Camlann, but mythically it remains open. The king departs, but his departure is shaped so that it keeps generating longing. That longing is not weakness. It is the legend's afterlife. A fully closed story can be admired. An open one can be inhabited. So after the last battle, after Excalibur disappears beneath the water and the old age withdraws, what remains is not only the ruin of Camelot. What remains is the sense that somewhere beyond the visible world, the king has not been fully spent. That is the last gift Avalon gives the legend. Not certainty, not restoration, but the right to hope without proof. And once Arthur becomes that kind of figure, he cannot belong only to the past anymore. He belongs to every age that feels itself diminished and still wants to imagine return. After Avalon, Arthur no longer belongs only to medieval story. Once the legend refuses to let him end cleanly, it also refuses to let him remain fixed in one age. Arthur passes out of Camelot, but not out of culture. The kingdom falls, the fellowship breaks, the king withdraws into mystery, and yet the story keeps moving. That is why Arthur lasts. Not simply because the old stories are famous. Not simply because swords, castles, queens, and quests are memorable. But because the legend keeps offering later ages a language for their own longings. One of the most important turning points in that afterlife comes with Thomas Malory. By the time Malory writes Le Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, Arthurian material is already old, rich, and varied. His importance lies not in invention, but in synthesis. He gathers kingship, fellowship, Lancelot and Guinevere, the Grail, civil war, Mordred, Camlann, and Arthur's passing into one powerful English form. That changes the fate of a legend. It gives it continuity. It gives it memorable shape. It gives later generations an entry point strong enough to carry the whole tradition forward. Malory also preserves the sadness at the heart of Arthurian legend. Even in its brightest moments, his world knows that greatness is difficult to keep. Camelot shines, but not without strain. That balance is one reason his version endured. Then comes print. William Caxton's printing of Malory helps carry Arthur into a new world. Print does more than preserve a text. It extends its reach and allows certain versions to become especially influential. Without that survival in print, Arthur's afterlife might have looked very different. Instead, the legend remains available. It can be rediscovered. It can be reinterpreted. It can be made to speak again. Arthur does not remain confined to the medieval world. Later centuries keep returning to him because they keep finding new uses for him. Sometimes he appears as the image of noble kingship, sometimes as the symbol of a lost ideal, sometimes as the ruler whose court dramatizes the conflict between aspiration and human weakness. That flexibility is one of Arthur's greatest strengths. He can be adapted without being emptied. He can change while still remaining recognizably himself. That is why he survives when many other medieval rulers become distant names. His legend is not tied to one single meaning. It is tied to a structure of meanings that keeps reopening. A major example of this reopening comes in the 19th century with Alfred, Lord Tennyson. In the Idylls of the King, Arthur becomes part of a distinctly modern moral imagination. The names remain familiar and the broad arc remains familiar, but the emotional emphasis shifts. Arthur becomes a way for a later age to think about itself. That pattern continues into modernity. Modern Arthurian retellings do not all agree on what matters most. Some return to a harsher, more historical Arthur, some lean fully into fantasy and myth, some focus on Lancelot and Guinevere, Merlin, Morgan, politics, or spiritual symbolism. This variety does not weaken Arthur. It proves how alive the legend still is. A dead tradition only repeats itself. A living one keeps transforming. That is what Arthur does. He survives by becoming available to reimagining without losing the old emotional bones that made him matter in the first place. Those bones remain stable. The rightful ruler, the shining court, the fellowship of great companions, the sword linked to wonder, the love that divides loyalty, the quest for a higher good, the betrayal from within, the last battle, the king who does not quite end. These images endure because they are more than plot devices. They are symbols dense enough to carry emotional weight across centuries. Excalibur is not just a weapon, it is rightful power touched by mystery. The Round Table is not just a table. It is the dream of honor without pettiness and fellowship, without humiliation. The Grail is not just a sacred object. It is the recognition that earthly greatness still falls short of the highest good. Avalon is not just an island. It is the refusal of hopeless finality. And Arthur himself is not just a king. He is the ruler through whom people imagine what it would mean for justice and splendor to exist together, even if only briefly. That is why Camelot remains such a powerful word. It has become shorthand for a radiant but fragile order, something glorious and vulnerable from the moment it appears. That tension is exactly why it lasts. A perfect kingdom with no cracks would feel lifeless. A broken kingdom with no beauty would not invite longing. Camelot matters because it gives beauty and loss equal power. Arthur matters because he stands at the center of both. This is also why the legend keeps speaking to cultures that feel themselves in decline, cultures searching for renewal, and individuals trying to reconcile admiration with disappointment. Arthur offers no easy answer. Camelot does not survive. The fellowship fails. Love wounds the court. Holiness surpasses earthly order. Betrayal ruins everything. And yet the story is not nihilistic. The legend is full of failure, but it is not hollow. The ideal is not mocked merely because it cannot last forever. Instead, the story insists that beauty, courage, loyalty, and justice matter even when they prove fragile in human hands. Camelot falls, but its fall does not make the dream worthless. It makes the dream mournable. Arthurian legend survives not because it promises permanent victory, but because it understands the human attachment to noble things that do not endure. People do not only love success, they also love lost greatness. Sometimes they love it more. Arthur gives that feeling one of its purest forms. He offers the memory of order, without pretending order can remain untouched. He offers fellowship without denying rivalry. He offers sanctity without denying failure. He offers return without offering proof. That combination is nearly impossible to exhaust. It is why new versions keep appearing. It is why audiences keep finding fresh uses for a king who, by ordinary standards, should have remained confined to medieval literature long ago. But Arthur was never only medieval literature. From the moment his story refused to close, he began becoming myth in the fullest sense. Not falsehood, but a narrative shape large enough to carry recurring truths. That is why even modern retellings that change details radically can still feel recognizably Arthurian. The armor may shift. The politics may shift. The balance between history and magic may shift. Yet the underlying emotional architecture remains. There is still a longing for rightful rule. There is still a court brighter than the world around it. There is still a fracture within the ideal. And there is still a fall that feels both inevitable and unbearable. And there is still the refusal to let the king disappear entirely. That may be the key to everything. So long as Arthur can return, symbolically or imaginatively, the legend never becomes only a ruin. It remains a source of pressure on the present. It keeps asking whether a better order can exist, whether greatness can survive corruption, and what people owe to ideals they know cannot be perfectly sustained. Those are not medieval questions alone. They are permanent ones. That is why Arthur lasts. Not because the past is quaint, but because the legend continues to describe something real about the way human beings hope, fail, remember, and begin again. And so the story that began in the uncertainty of post-Roman Britain ends not with silence, but with endurance. A war leader became a king. A king became the center of a shining world. That world produced fellowship, wonder, holiness, love, betrayal, and ruin. Then the king passed into mystery and stayed there long enough to become more than himself. He became a language for lost ideals. He became a memory that acts like expectation. He became the image of a kingdom too beautiful to keep and too meaningful to forget. That is the final truth of Arthur. Camelot fell. Arthur did not. Not completely. He remains wherever people look at a broken world and still want to imagine that justice, courage, loyalty, and splendor might once again be gathered into one place. And that is why the legends of King Arthur never really end. If you enjoyed drifting through the legends of King Arthur, please like the video and subscribe to Circadian History for more calm journeys through history, myth, and the ancient world. Let me know in the comments which legend, kingdom, or figure you'd like to fall asleep to next.